The now longest shutdown in U.S. history continues. Donald Trump's signature tariff program confronts the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court and the ongoing battle, both publicly and privately behind the scenes, for the heart and soul of the American right. The New York Times and the ladies of The View are seemingly interested in making certain individuals the face of the right. What could their interest possibly be? All of that and more in today's episode of The Josh Hammer Show. So officially 2 days ago at midnight, so late Tuesday evening, Wednesday morning, we now have the longest shutdown in the history of the United States. Really, like literally number one, not 2, not 3, not 4, but literally number one. This is now over 5 weeks long. It has officially surpassed the first Trump term shutdown of 2018 to 2019. If you are not a political junkie, you could easily be forgiven for wondering what the heck is going on, what are the demands both sides, and why have they not been able to actually reach a deal? And perhaps most importantly, how does it affect you? How does it actually affect your bottom line? I have been very critical since day one of the Democrats' strategy in this particular shutdown. Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and Hakeem Jeffries, leader of the Democrats in the House, have tag-teamed this, but their coalition has started to fracture. John Fetterman, one of the more reasonable members of the Senate Democratic Caucus, already started to break loose about a week and a half ago or so, telling the New York Post and other outlets that it was time to just get this done and to start opening up the government. The president of the largest public sector employee union in America, that is the Union for Federal Government Employees and State and Local Government Employees, the president of that union also saying, end this shutdown, it's over. But Schumer and Jeffries have steered the course. Now, there was a real argument to be made that the Democrats seemingly were doing this just to boost turnout in the various elections on Tuesday, namely the mayoral showdown in New York City and the 2 gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia. That was my read on the situation. For what it's worth, you say that big bad Donald Trump and John Thune and Mike Johnson, no, they're shutting down the American people, all these poor federal workers who are furloughed or fired, they're not going to get their paychecks. Oh, they're shutting down Pearl Harbor and Mount Rushmore and Yellowstone National Park, which, yeah, they're not shutting it down, but on the margins, you actually are starting to get some increasing anecdotes that national parks, national forests, access is increasingly limited due to staff shortages. Some of that is happening there. So it seems to me that the Democrats, my read was that they were keeping the shutdown in order to boost turnout, to boost their far-left voter base on Tuesday, and I expected there to be a deal literally either yesterday or perhaps today. And who knows, maybe by the time the weekend starts, maybe by tomorrow evening, there actually will be a deal. But for now, there is currently no deal. There is no deal to be had, and the ramifications are increasingly starting to hit home. Wall Street Journal has a brand new story this morning how the U.S. is going to reduce flight traffic by 10%. 10% reduction in flight traffic at 40 airports, 40 of the top airports in the country. This, according to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. They are ordering traffic to be reduced by 10% at 40 major airports. This is all being conveyed by the Transportation Secretary of the United States, Sean Duffy, who says, quote, this is about where the pressure and how do we alleviate the pressure. It's a bit of a mess. It's increasingly a bit of a mess. And by the way, you would be forgiven for having some serious concerns about air traffic right now. I think many Americans are wondering why there is a seeming increase in the number of airplane incidents, of airplanes that are running into each other over on the runway while they are taxiing. We still don't really have any particularly clear answers as to how there was that catastrophic crash between the military chopper and the commercial American Airlines plane outside Reagan National Airport earlier this year, back in January. So you might be forgiven for having some concerns at this moment about air travel, especially right now, this time of the year. I mean, the Thanksgiving holiday is coming up in just a few weeks. Christmas is not too much longer after that. This really is not the time to mess with the security and the general availability of air travel. John Thune, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, was just seen talking about exactly that point. Let's go ahead and watch that.
Have the American people suffered enough? Or do Democrats need more? Democrats have snarled air traffic. They've damaged small businesses. They've left federal workers in line at food banks. They've jeopardized food assistance. Food assistance Mr. President, for 40 million Americans. Are they satisfied now? Or does the far left want more? Surely Democrats have hit enough milestones. The election is over. Democrats now have the extremely dubious honor of being responsible for the longest government shutdown in American history.
So Marjorie Taylor Greene is getting near the same point that I was getting at, which is that, okay, look, this is deeply cynical stuff. This is deeply self-serving stuff there. But maybe if you want to shut it down, I mean, forget about all the employees who've been furloughed and fired. Forget about those families living paycheck to paycheck who are going without a paycheck for over a month now. Okay, fine. Hold that aside. If you are that cynical, if you are that short-term driven, then maybe, just maybe, there was an argument to do this in order to boost voter turnout. And I guess there's some argument that maybe that actually might have had an effect on the margins. After all, New York City had the largest voter turnout in a mayoral election in decades, in very much in my entire lifetime. So is there a direct connection between that? Maybe not. Very hard to say, but it's over. The elections this week are done. Democrats won. They won in New York City. They won in New Jersey. They won in Virginia. They won. So what are you guys hoping to accomplish at this point? What exactly are Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries hoping to accomplish at this particular moment? In previous shutdown fights, going back decades, the minority party, the party that controls, in this particular case, as the case may be, not the White House and neither house of Congress. So the minority party that is in the weaker negotiating position, historically speaking, they typically have a very clearly enunciated stance. There is a compelling reason that they are able to communicate to the American people in soundbite fashion. Elevator pitch, 10 to 30-second kind of argument. What's your argument? Why are you doing this? Why is this worth it to the American people? Why is it worth it to have a 10% reduction in air traffic in the lead up to the Thanksgiving holiday of all freaking times of the year? Why is it worth it for you? What is in it for you that you will benefit? And Democrats are completely unable to explain that. They are completely incapable of articulating exactly what their stance is, because their stance is actually, frankly, quite arcane and abstruse. They want the continuation of certain expiring Obamacare subsidies. What they're not telling you is that those expiring Obamacare subsidies, which Republicans are currently refusing to negotiate on, to their credit, I would argue, what the Democrats are not telling you is that those expiring subsidies disproportionately benefit blue states. Why? Well, if you remember the original way that the Obamacare law, the actual statute, the way that it was formulated, you had certain states that could agree to go along with essentially a national government, a nationalization of healthcare, where the feds would come in and run the private exchanges. It was typically blue states that did that. It was red states that decided not to. Well, if these subsidies that are now on the precipice of expiring, if they're not continued, it is those blue states that agreed to have a nationalized federal government takeover of the private insurance healthcare marketplace. It is those states that stand to have a 30% increase in the average health insurance premium. It is the other states, namely red states, that refuse to go along with the Affordable Care Act's federal government takeover. They will only see a roughly, give or take, 15% increase in premium. Which, to be clear, is still a lot. 15 to 17%, it depends on the state, obviously. That's still a lot, but that's roughly half of the expected premium increase in the blue states that subjected themselves to the Obamacare national healthcare takeover. So it's deeply cynical stuff. It is deeply self-serving stuff. And, there's already been a partial reduction in SNAP in food stamps. It's hanging on by a bare thread right now when it comes to one of these rogue lower court judges that has put some sort of a preliminary injunction, overstepping judicial authority, neither here nor there for present purposes. So a partial disbursement of SNAP is now hanging on by just the barest of bare legal threads. The real line in the sand moment for yours truly, and I would say for you too, is rapidly approaching. November 15th is the date that I saw that if nothing happens before then, it seems like Pete Hegseth and the Department of War will not be able to engage in any kind of accounting at that point in order to actually pay our active duty armed service members. That would be a catastrophe, an absolute moral stain on the American people, on our government, on our elected officials. And it would have a disastrous effect when it comes to disincentivizing military recruitment, one of the foremost goals of this current Department of Defense, now Department of War. It was literally one of the reasons that Pete Hegseth was nominated for that role in the first place. It was one of the reasons why I personally vociferously supported his nomination, because he is a young, telegenic guy who served in numerous post 9/11 wars as part of the broader global war on terror, as it was known back then. And he was arguing, and indeed thus far this year he has given results such that there are more people signing up to volunteer for the military. So we've seen the results. He's been good at that. This would throw all that away. It would throw all that away. It's terrible. You're seriously playing with fire at that point. You are seriously playing with fire when you start talking about getting a paycheck out to the active duty armed service members there. Now, the polling is mixed. I want to tell you that the American people are overwhelmingly blaming the Democrats. It's not necessarily the case. Depends on the pollster. Fox News poll that I saw did indeed have more Americans blame the Democrats by a very mild, moderate margin. Other polls, including a recent one from NBC, have more of the American people blaming Republicans. So the blame game is close enough where there is seemingly a lot of blame the American people are telling their pollsters to go all around. But we are rapidly getting to the point, if we are not there, that there are going to be serious ramifications. Again, I don't care as much about the partial food stamp snap shutdown. I definitely care about it to an extent because I'm not a libertarian. I do believe in small but efficient government, and I believe in such thing as a welfare state. It also is the case that over 40 million people are on food stamps. That is all but assuredly far too high. But there's that. There is indeed the increasing number of reports coming out of here about national forest and national park reduction in staff. Now we're talking about a 10% reduction in actual air traffic at 40 of the biggest airports in the country at this time of the year, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and worst of all, a potentially looming November 15th deadline to actually pay the honorable men and women of the United States Armed Forces. That is no good, folks. Nothing good can happen when we start going down that circle. It's time for the adults in charge to fix this, and to fix this ASAP. In other news out of Washington, as we discussed on yesterday's show, Donald Trump's signature tariff program was argued yesterday at the United States Supreme Court. And the takeaway is that it didn't seem to go super well necessarily for John Sauer, the Solicitor General of the United States, and a deeply capable attorney. There were numerous of the swing justices, such as Justice Gorsuch, who's not necessarily super swing. He's typically closer to the right flank, to Justices Alito and Thomas, but on some of these structural constitutional issues there, he's not necessarily a big executive power guy, let's put it that way. So Justice Gorsuch seems to be leaning towards the plaintiffs in this case, which is to say that he is leaning against the legality of the statute program. He actually asked a very interesting question. He offered an example that would be anathema to the current administration. He said, quote, could the president impose a 50% tariff on gas-powered cars and auto parts to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad of climate change? And in response to this, the Solicitor General of the United States, John Sauer, did concede that another president could use the same power for such purposes. So, you know, if you're not a legal nerd, this is kind of how it works, right? Is Justice asked these very interesting, provocative at times examples, trying to kind of tease out what is the limiting legal principle of the argument you are making. So to kind of just briefly recap here, for those who missed yesterday's show, 50 U.S. Code Section 1701, which codifies the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, this Jimmy Carter era 1977 statute. This is the relevant statutory provision that we're talking about here. The Trump administration claims that it is able to authorize its sweeping tariff program because there is a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. Now, the basic argument that I was making yesterday, and there were some votes that seemingly will vote to uphold this. It looks like Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, who are generally two more robust supporters of executive branch Article 2 power, they both seemed pretty sympathetic to Solicitor General Sauer's arguments. The basic argument for this is that it is not the role of the judges to second guess the president as to what exactly constitutes a national emergency when it comes to invoking this particular provision of the statute. And this president, I think, has a uniquely sound argument when it comes to invoking this particular statute when it comes to imposing tariffs for the following reason, which is that most presidents, just historically speaking, going back to the origins of the Republic and the original American system of political economy when it comes to manufacturing and tariff policy and protectionism, I'm thinking here of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, that strand, that type of protectionists, that type of maybe even mercantilists back in the day, those folks who were really big on reducing trade deficits and boosting manufacturing, they thought of tariffs primarily as just revenue-raising measures. And sure enough, prior to the ratification of the 16th Amendment in the early 20th century during the Woodrow Wilson administration, the 16th Amendment is what constitutionalized the income tax. A lot of people forget this, folks. Prior to the 16th Amendment, the number one way to raise revenue for the federal government was not the income tax. It didn't exist. It literally didn't exist. The vast majority of revenue was raised prior to that from tariffs, from tariff policy. There were other mechanisms as well, but income tax was not really a thing, so to speak. In any event, the difference between those men, the Hamiltons, dare I even say the Lincolns of the world, and President Trump, on the other hand, is that President Trump thinks of, conceives, and actually utilizes tariff policy not merely as a means of bringing in revenue for the Treasury, of boosting the federal fisc, and so forth. No, he actually uses it as a legitimate use of foreign policy and diplomacy. He thinks of the trade deficit, and he conceives of it subjectively, idiosyncratically. He thinks of it as something that is not merely an economic issue, but rather that it is an issue of national security. And he actually then uses tariff policy as part of his foreign policy. So when he's trying to put pressure on Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, when he is trying to put pressure on Xi Jinping and the Politburo, perhaps even this tragic situation in Nigeria. If you've been following it at all, there's a horrific genocide of sorts by Boko Haram and radical Islamists in Nigeria against the besieged Christian population. Nigeria is a roughly 50-50 divided Islamic Christian country. And the government does not have a monopoly on the use of force, as a sovereign entity should. Boko Haram, the Islamist terror organization there, is wreaking havoc. And the question that President Trump and others are thinking about is, what can the United States do short of military action? Well, one thing that you might consider doing is slapping massive tariffs on Nigeria, which in theory is one of the more Western-aligned or more Western-friendly of the Western African states. So again, this is another example as to how tariffs might be used not just as tools of raising revenue, but as tools of statecraft, as tools of foreign policy. So it seems to me that in a situation like this, where the president is choosing to think of trade deficits, and he indeed acts upon thinking about trade deficits as tools of foreign policy and national security and not merely as tools of raising revenue there, then the justice should typically be hands-off. They shouldn't wade in too deeply there. It is a dangerous game to get into the business of trying to overthink this. Okay, it is true that the 1977 statute in question does not specifically, by literal textual word, does not specifically authorize the imposition of tariffs, but it does speak more broadly about foreign commerce. What is the key instrument of foreign commerce? Tariffs. I mean, at some point, lawyers love to make things more complicated than they are. I'm frankly not entirely sure that this is the most complicated thing in the world. Here is Speaker Mike Johnson talking about how he actually has a disagreement with Justice Neil Gorsuch on the tariffs case argued at the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday.
I don't find myself in disagreement with Justice Gorsuch too often, but I think he's missed the mark on this one. First of all, I don't think you should read too much into the questioning that you heard at the Supreme Court. I mean, this is part of judicial review. It's a cherished part of that tradition. I used to be one of those litigators. I did constitutional law, oral argument, and I would have liked to have argued that case yesterday because I think the law is clearly on the side of what the administration has done. If I felt like the executive branch had overstepped its bounds on trade or on the tariffs or something, I would have stepped in. I mean, that's my job as the Speaker of the House over the legislative branch. I would have done it in my own way, to be candid. I would have gone to the president privately and said, hey, sir, enough. I think you're overstepped the bounds. Let's try to figure that out. I wouldn't have publicly had a big spat with him because it wouldn't have been necessary. But that conversation didn't happen because I believe that what he's done is well within the bounds. And so we'll see what the court does. Yeah.
Scott Bessent, for what it's worth, the Treasury Secretary, was also very optimistic. He told Fox Business yesterday after the oral argument, he was sitting there, I believe, in the front row, or he was sitting very near the front of the courthouse watching this oral argument in person. And there was some support. I mean, there definitely was some support for the legal argument that I had presented to you. Justice Sam Alito, as I said, probably the most outwardly amenable to the administration's arguments. Even Brett Kavanaugh, who was another one of these swing voters. It's really Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett who are the most swing voters in the court. Gorsuch is swingy on some cases, including some executive power versus congressional power cases like this. Even Brett Kavanaugh did say, though, that, quote, presumably Congress wants to give the president tools to respond to the emergency in an appropriate way. And Kavanaugh then asked why Congress would prohibit the president from using tariffs while giving him so many other tools to respond to an emergency. That's essentially what I'm saying, too, is if the statute allows the president to engage in foreign commerce, if there's an emergency there, why not tariffs as well? And look, if the court really wants to get into the business of trying to exactly delineate what is and is not an emergency as defined by the president, I suppose that's fine to an extent, but you're going to have to really stick with that and be consistent about that there. As someone who is generally not the biggest fan of judicial power, there is something in law called the political question doctrine, which essentially says that when there is an inherently political question, then the judges try to stay out of it. It's not exactly a super neat doctrinal fit for the question at hand there, but the general notion is that when it comes to some of these inherently political questions, that it is best for Article 3, for Hamilton's so-called least dangerous branch, that is to say the federal judiciary, to know its place. We'll see what happens there. For what it's worth, if I'm just trying to count votes here, which is always an inherently fraught and dangerous exercise after an oral argument, but if I'm just trying to count votes here, I actually do not think that the Trump administration has the votes. I would like to be proven wrong on this, but if I were advising Secretary Bessent and the Treasury Secretary, his office, and the president there, I would say you should probably try to have some contingency plans in place, because my best guess right now is that this is probably going to not be upheld by a count of 5-4, maybe even 6-3, potentially 7-2, but I think it'll probably be 5-4 or 6-3. In any event, we shall see. Meanwhile, while all this is happening in Washington, D.C., there is this broader conversation that we've discussed on this show so many times over the past week, and I've got a sneaking suspicion it's not going to go away anytime soon. What is happening on the political right? What is happening right now when it comes to the nature of the conservative movement, when it comes to the nature of MAGA, and on and on and on? We've had numerous guests on the show recently to discuss this in whole or in part. We had Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee, Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report, Dinesh D'Souza of our sister podcast on the Salem Podcast Network, the Dinesh D'Souza Podcast. The debate continues. In some ways, actually, I think it was thrust out into the open this week, because there is a really devious tactic that I just can't help but notice, and I feel compelled to speak up about it. The corporate mainstream media, enemies of the conservative movement, enemies of MAGA, have decided, in what seems to me like a quite possibly coordinated strategy, to elevate some of the kookiest, fringiest voices and trying to present them as the face of the right. What kind of interests could The View, could the New York Times, MSNBC, etc., what kind of vested interest could they possibly have in boosting people like Nick Fuentes and Marjorie Taylor Greene as the face of the American right? Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene was indeed on The View this week. And boy, was it an absolute doozy of a performance. Let's go ahead and watch Marjorie Taylor Greene on The View. Watch this first clip.
I am so America first. I feel like I live it and breathe it. And that's my district, and that's what people want. They are so tired of their hard-earned tax dollars being sent overseas to foreign wars and foreign aid and foreign causes, while life in America just becomes more and more unaffordable. We want this money invested at home for our infrastructure, for programs, for our people, and most importantly, for my children's generation and their children and their children and generations to come. And I have to say, that's what I've campaigned on the entire time. Everybody's like, Marjorie Taylor Greene has changed. And I'm like, oh, no, nothing has changed about me. I am staying absolutely 100% true to the people that voted for me and true to my district. And I am so angry when I drive around my district to all these beautiful little rural small towns. And there's manufacturing plants that are crumbling from decades of lost industry, small businesses that got shuttered during COVID lockdowns and COVID shutdowns. And you want to know something else, Whoopi? So many veterans that went over and had to fight in some war that really had nothing to do with where they were from or their hometown, and their lives and families' lives have been so affected. So for me, I am unapologetically America first.
She says she's unapologetically America first. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you probably would have been best to be marriage first. You know, the woman who is now seen all over social media talking about, you know, Christian identity, America, how seemingly how the Jews have no role to play in MAGA on the right there. You know, where was your faith when you cheated on your husband and you are an adulterer and you ended up divorcing your husband because of that? Seems to me like that might have been a good time to put on your whole newfangled Christian identity. Pretty sure that's in the Ten Commandments. I'm pretty sure that's the shared inheritance, actually, of Jews and Christians. No matter what, you have these new heretical Marcionites like Tucker Carlson saying anything to the contrary. It seems to me like the Old Testament is part of that. I mean, I don't know. Where would anyone get the idea that adultery is wrong? You know, Mrs. America first. Here's more from Marjorie Taylor Greene on The View talking about how she is actually not, in fact, anti-Semitic.
Well, first, I'm not anti-Semitic, but I am critical of the Israeli government.
Well, I just mean domestically speaking, because a lot of Nick Fuentes' words are, he hits every group, but very much just Jewish people in general, not Israel, Jewish people.
Well, number one, I don't have to agree with his words on attacking people like that. However, as a lawmaker, I think it's incredibly important that I defend our First Amendment for every single American. Of course, that does not apply to death threats or anything like that. However, I think the most important thing we can have as Americans is our free speech, and it can be speech that I either agree with or completely disagree with.
But it's something interesting you said. You said you're critical of the Israeli government, but you are not anti-Semitic. Most people now believe that if you criticize the Israeli government, you are anti-Semitic. Do you disagree with that?
Actually, I disagree with
Or I should say many people.
I would say that tide has completely changed. I think many Americans today see the difference is you can love Jewish Americans and you can love Jewish people and not be critical of people at all. And you can, I have the right to criticize a foreign government. And I can criticize as many of them as I want. And I can say October 7th was the worst thing and horrific, but I can equally say starving children and killing innocent people and children in Gaza is also horrible.
All right, I mean, holy straw man. Literally no one is calling into question. No one is calling into question your ability to criticize any foreign government, the one that is the one that's run by the Jews or literally any other throughout the world. No one is arguing that. And also, just what a moron. This whole First Amendment defense of the Tucker Fuentes interview. This is not a First Amendment issue. No one is talking about the government censoring Tucker Carlson's show and whoever the heck he wants to host on there. He could host David Duke and it wouldn't be a First Amendment issue. Whatever he wants. It's not about that. It's about who we are on the right. And by the way, Marjorie Taylor Greene, no First Amendment right to death threats. That would be news to me. Because Marjorie Taylor Greene, you were literally the only elected official I notice who last week joined the clearly coordinated op, and yes, it was an op, to say that I somehow was calling for the assassination of Tucker Carlson, which, God forbid, I obviously was not doing. In case you missed this stupid faux manufactured controversy from these awful bad faith actors, I was writing an op-ed for the Daily Mail, the well-known British newspaper, talking about the threat of Tucker Carlson more broadly, and ended this op-ed by talking about how the fox is in the henhouse and the best way to save the current GOP coalition is to neutralize the fox. By which I obviously meant to counteract Tucker's terrible ideas and terrible influence. And a bunch of morons, initially the libertarian so-called comedian Hack, who have debated twice now, much to my chagrin. Dave Smith was the first, I think, to point out, oh my God, Josh Hammer is calling for Tucker Carlson's assassination. No, I'm not, you freaking moron. You absolute scathing piece of you-know-what. And then Candace Owens gets in, all the various, Jew-hating scumbags. And who's the only elected official? Marjorie Taylor Greene. When Marjorie Taylor Greene says, disingenuously and stupidly, that Josh Hammer is calling for Tucker Carlson's assassination, she's putting a target on me. That is effectively a death threat, in fact, by any other name. She's the only elected official who was too stupid to not realize, apparently, what I meant by neutralize in that comment, to counteract the influence of, you stupid dweeb. Good riddance. But why is The View doing this? Why are the liberal ladies of The View fluffing Marjorie Taylor Greene and presenting her, much as Tucker did to Fuentes? Why are they trying to sanitize her and present her as this deeply reasonable person? As someone who just objects to the nefarious foreign government of Israel and blah, 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 blah. Well, it's the same reason, I would argue, that the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg, the liberal columnist of the New York Times, had this utterly astonishing column earlier this week, titled "Nick Fuentes was Charlie Kirk's bitter enemy. Now he's becoming his successor." And the photo of Nick Fuentes with the hair slicked back, looking sideways, unmistakable James Dean vibes. That's what they're trying to do. The New York Times is calling Nick Fuentes Charlie Kirk's successor, which he's not. He's obviously not. Dude didn't even vote for Donald Trump last year. He didn't vote for Donald Trump. Charlie Kirk, on the other hand, oversaw, via his Turning Point USA Action organization, the largest millennial and Gen Z mass turnout operation in the history of modern American politics. Nick Fuentes is not fit to lick Charlie Kirk's bootstraps. He is not fit to do anything other than to impotently yell like the loathsome little incel he is to all of his fans, just chomping at the bit about him talking about how Hitler was really effing cool. He is not the successor to Charlie Kirk. He is a world-class piece of stewing garbage, and he needs to be rejected as such. So that raises the obvious question then. Why is the New York Times not only not rejecting Nick Fuentes, but calling him Charlie Kirk's successor? Why are the ladies of The View presenting Marjorie Taylor Greene as this leader of MAGA, the right, whatever you want to call it? And the reason is obvious, is it not? Because they want these caricatures of human beings to represent the right. They want the right. The left wants the right to be as kooky and easily dismissed as possible. They want Marjorie Taylor Greene and Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson to be the face of the right. They want to be able to say, maybe with actually a little credence when it comes to people like Fuentes, that the right is just a bunch of Nazis. As a Jewish conservative, I've been fighting off for years and years and years these scurrilous allegations of left-wingers that Donald Trump is a Nazi, that his movements are a bunch of Nazis. Well, when you're trying to sanitize and mainstream Nick Fuentes, a guy who literally says that Hitler was really effing cool, well, it makes it a little harder to rebut the allegation that the right is being infiltrated by Nazis. When you have an elected official like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is insanely saying that I called for Tucker Carlson's assassination, who is refusing to condemn Nick Fuentes, well, again, maybe the right actually does have a small, to be clear, a small, but a nonetheless potentially extremely dangerous neo-Nazi problem. The problem is this. Let's hold morals aside. Let's pretend for a second that you are the most amoral person, not immoral, but amoral. You don't give a crap about the Bible, Western morality. You should, to be clear. But let's just say hypothetically that you don't give the smallest crap possible about the Bible, morality, about what is right, wrong, good, evil, etc., etc. All you care about, let's pretend, is winning elections. That is the sole thing that you are focused on. From that perspective, this flirtation with literal Nazis makes zero freaking sense. For every 19-year-old incel Rumble streamer who finds in Nick Fuentes a sympathetic voice because he too is an incel closeted homosexual or whatever, for every person like that you think you are bringing into the quote-unquote coalition, whatever the coalition even means at that point, you are going to repel 3 to 5 times more voters for every one that you bring in. Why? Because most of the American people have not lost their damn mind yet. That is the very simple and obvious reason for that. Whether it's folks in the middle of the American political spectrum, or whether it is sane, rational folks on the right who don't want anything to do with that. Nothing. Tucker Carlson, for what it's worth, not a literal Nazi, but certainly seems to have no problem fluffing and platforming Nazi apologists like Darryl Cooper. He's had him on twice. The guy who said Churchill was the biggest villain in World War II. The only reason that the Jews were slaughtered in the camps was because there were a bunch of displaced persons and the Germans just didn't really know what to do with it. Oh yeah, sure, dude. Sure. It's not like Hitler literally announced exactly what he would do in his actual book, Mein Kampf, decades before he rose to power. Duh. It's not like, Tucker is bringing on, actual, people who say Hitler is cool Nazis. Oh, yeah, he did, Nick Fuentes. It's hard not to bring the conversation back to Tucker because he is now at the center of this storm, after having brought on Fuentes, the whole tempest in a teapot at the Heritage Foundation with the president, Kevin Roberts, who, again, is a good man, a friend, who did a very dumb and bad thing, which he now, by the way, acknowledges is a very dumb and bad thing, so I'm not putting words in his mouth. He said that himself with this video defending Carlson. The tragedy of Tucker Carlson, holding aside the fact that I was a mega fan of his. Tucker and I had pleasant private emails. He was deeply gracious to me. I was a former guest on his show. I used to watch his monologues every single night during the COVID-19 lockdowns. He was the singular voice of unmitigated clarity on cable news back then. The tragedy of Tucker, beyond just my former admiration of him, is that unlike a Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, Tucker is actually a smart guy. Tucker is a deeply talented broadcaster when he wants to be, when he's not putting on this stupid face, and asking the dumbest questions in the world, which is all his show is these days. But when he wants to be a talented broadcaster, oh man, few more talented than that. Back in the day, Tucker used to be more of a writer too. As a writer myself, Tucker's writing was phenomenal. He's a very talented guy. So what has happened? What exactly has happened to him? I mean, among the other things that has happened to Tucker is he too has seemingly lost the ability to discern right from wrong, Western civilization from barbarism, truth from falsehood, good from evil, etc. Tucker was not always like that, for what it's worth. There's this amazing clip. We played it on our show once before, but we're going to play it again here. There's this amazing clip of Tucker Carlson on C-SPAN from 1999, I believe the year is, talking about the questionable person that was Pat Buchanan, someone who all these same folks, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, they're all now chomping at the bit, clamoring for Pat Buchanan to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Well, a man by the name of Tucker Carlson, back in 1999, had thoughts on that. Let's go ahead and watch.
He listed an example of what some of the positions that the Israelis are taking in this country. Would you care to comment on that, please?
Well, I mean, you know, it's perfectly valid to question America's relationship with Israel. Israel has a lobby. It's perfectly fair, as far as I'm concerned, to beat up on Israel's lobby. But that's not, I don't think that's the reason that Buchanan is being labeled an anti-Semite. It's this kind of, as I've said, this relentless bringing up topics related to Judaism. I mean, famously, Pat, you know, always beats up on Goldman Sachs, but never Morgan Stanley. I mean, it's really hard to. There is no point at which Pat Buchanan has held a press conference and said, you know, I really don't like the Jews. I think they're a sinister force in America. But I think, and it took me years to come to this position. I mean, I'm not throwing the term anti-Semite around. But you reach a point when you say, well, gee, you know, here's a guy who has gone out of his way to defend Demjanjuk and other accused Nazi war criminals, who's constantly attacked Israel, who's attacked American Jews for supporting Israel unduly, who's implied that American Jews push America into wars in which non-Jews die. There really is, and again, I'm not hysterical on this subject, but I do believe that there is a pattern with Pat Buchanan of needling the Jews. Is that anti-Semitic? Yeah. I mean, after a while, you conclude it is, in some sense, anti-Semitic. I mean, Pat Buchanan obviously has a lot of personal and affectionate relationships with people who are Jewish. So on a personal level, perhaps he's not. But on a different, maybe thematic level, I think he probably is.
What is there possibly to say after that? Is that not literally what Tucker Carlson is today in the year 2025? Where something like 75 to 80% of his newsletters, according to a friend of mine who subscribes, mention the Jews or Israel. His newsletter just this morning, trying to defend the wildly left-wing, self-hating Jews in New York City who voted for Zohran Mamdani. It's something else every day. Earlier this week, he compared the plight of Christians in Gaza and Judea and Samaria to the plight of Christians in Nigeria, the ones who are getting slaughtered by Boko Haram. He's obsessed. It's not hard to look at Tucker Carlson's editorial choices. The relitigating of World War II. Maybe the United States should have sided with Hitler over Stalin. His latest shtick, that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is actually not part of Western civilization. Something that would have really, really, really been news to the American founders. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which has Leviticus inscribed on the outside. It's not hard to look at that. Look at the relitigating World War II. The notion that Mark Levin has unchristian views. That Ben Shapiro is inciting violence or glorifies violence. That Josh Hammer hates Europeans. Another one of these insane bullcrap things they say about me. It's not hard to see what you're doing here. And it's the exact same thing that Tucker accused Pat Buchanan of doing a quarter century ago. Going after Goldman Sachs, but not Morgan Stanley, etc., etc., etc. No one denies that Tucker can be personally charming. I've seen that myself. I'm sure Marjorie Taylor Greene can be personally charming. A lot of these guys can be. But these views are utterly toxic. A friend of mine told me this morning that he actually attended the Megyn Kelly rally in White Plains, New York, where I was actually born. I was born in White Plains Hospital. But he attended the Megyn Kelly rally last night with Tucker. Apparently the crowd was divided 50-50, my friend says, and there were lots of people shouting, Nazi, Nazi, at the stage. Is this how you build a political movement? Is this how you bring in new voters? Is this, in the aftermath of Tuesday's disappointing results, how you expand the coalition? Are you out of your freaking mind? No. No, no, no. Get back to basics. Ditch the kooks. And be a sane, conservative movement that cares about the day-to-day concerns of the American people. Is that really, really too much to ask for? We shall see. I'm Josh Hammer, and thank you for listening and watching The Josh Hammer Show.